Vermont, one of the most progressive states in the country, the home of Bernie Sanders. It's also a very rural state. These things seem to contradict themselves. Across the United States, the rule appears to be that rural states should be heavily favoring the Republican Party. So how is Vermont so progressive when the state is so rural? In today's video, we will talk about the history of Vermont, from its strange beginnings to its equally weird modern day. Vermont is located in the northeastern United States in a region known as New England. Vermont is by far the smallest state within the region, with Maine, the second smallest state in New England, having double the population of Vermont. Like some other states in New England, Vermont is not very large by area. Vermont's total area is only 9,620 square miles. This makes Vermont the 45th largest state. When your state is smaller than a chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you know that your state is very small. When a state is this small, you must wonder why it even became a state. I mean, there was never even a Vermont colony back before the Revolutionary War. Why didn't some other state just take the land and incorporate it into its own state? Well, that's the thing. Other states have tried and failed. Vermont, like any other US territory, was first inhabited by Native Americans. It is estimated that about 10,000 Native people lived in the area of Vermont around the time of European settlement, with the vast majority of them being wiped out by Old World diseases. Vermont was originally split between the French and English until the Treaty of Paris, the 1763 one, ended the 7 Years' War, granting England most of the French territory in Northern America. This meant that Vermont was open for most New Englanders to settle. However, the process of actually getting settlers in the region would be very complicated. Originally, the Massachusetts colony was looking to colonize the region and integrate it as a part of its own colony, just like Maine. In fact, Massachusetts was also seeking to annex all of the land of the colony of New Hampshire that was west of the Merrimack River. However, after the Royal Charter was revised, the Massachusetts colony was disallowed from moving any further north. This ensured that New Hampshire would have all of its territory east of the Connecticut River, and presented the colony with an opportunity to settle in Vermont. However, New York, the Empire State, the Empire Province, also wanted the territory of Vermont, leading to a dispute which would last over a decade. New Hampshire and New York both had different methods for settling Vermont. New Hampshire would build many town-sized settlements known as New Hampshire grants. This allowed for many more people to move into the territory. In contrast to this, New York would offer much of the land of Vermont to the wealthy. In fact, most of these land grants would actually conflict with the New Hampshire grants. Of course, this was unacceptable to New York, the Empire Province. That doesn't really ring. So New York took New Hampshire to court, a royal court. After some deliberation, a royal order was declared in 1764, which granted New York the entirety of Vermont. To understand why this was such a baffling decision, you need to understand that the vast majority of Vermont settlers were given their land through New Hampshire. This made all of these settlers at the mercy of New York, and New York was not feeling merciful. The reason New York wanted to squash New Hampshire's claim to Vermont was to secure their own land grants. However, in order to secure those grants, New York had to invalidate everyone's New Hampshire grants, potentially putting the vast majority of Vermont towns in danger. The biggest slap in the face was when New York demanded that all the settlers must pay New York an inflated rate for their land which they were already living on. By 1770, New York's Supreme Court solidified that all of New Hampshire's grants were invalid. This led to the rise of the Green Mountain Boys, a militia organized by Ethan Allen. The militia would resist New York's attempts to reinforce the decision on unrecognizing the New Hampshire land grants. New York probably would have eventually been able to subdue this uprising, and maybe Vermont would have been part of New York. This almost definitely would have happened. New York definitely really wanted that land. They even sold all those grants of land in Vermont to the rich people, and you can't let the rich down. Unfortunately for New York, it's 1770, and you know what that means. It's time for revolution. Now that the American Revolution has begun, New York was too occupied to deal with the rebels in Vermont properly. Thus, Vermonters during this time were beginning to solidify their control over their borders. However, New York still had some control over the territory. This angered the residents of Vermont, since they wanted to join the new United States as a new independent state. But New York still wasn't letting Vermont join. So when a convention of several Vermont towns in Westminster renounced the authority of New York police officers on March 13th, 1775 would kill 2 men in an event later named the Westminster Massacre. The result of this was a mass riot in Vermont, which led to many New Yorkers in the region being hunted down by local residents. states. New York was not happy about this, but there was little it could do at this point. 2 years after the incident, delegates from Vermont declared the creation of the Vermont Republic in the very same courthouse in Westminster where the massacre had taken place. Now the Vermont Republic was its own independent country. One of the most interesting things the new country would do is outlaw the practice of slavery, with some exceptions. Perhaps this could be seen as part of the origin of the state's progressiveness. Despite this, Vermont was still keen on joining the United States, but only under the condition of it being its own state. However, New York, still bitter about the loss of Vermont, refused to allow Vermont's entrance into the Union. One must imagine that the people of Vermont must have developed some kind of paranoia against its neighbors who may have wanted to integrate the territory into its own state. By this time, the United States had not admitted any other state into the Union other than the original 13, and most of the 13 colonies made lofty claims over the rest of the country. Perhaps New York would come back and attempt to recapture Vermont. Maybe New Hampshire would attempt to bring back Vermont into the fold. Despite this fear, the people of Vermont were not going to allow that to happen.
Come York or come Hampshire, come traitors our names. If ye rule o'er our lands, ye shall rule o'er our graves. Our vow is recorded, our banner unfurled. In the name of Vermont we defy all the world.
Due to this state of limbo between being a US state and an independent country, some were fed up with the idea of independence entirely. After a few Native American raids against Vermont, some officials began secret talks to rejoin the British Empire in 1780. Thankfully, this ended up never happening. This state of limbo was not going to last forever. After Vermont agreed to pay the state of New York compensation of $30,000 for New York's claim over the territory in 1790, Vermont was officially admitted into the United States as the 14th state on March 4th, 1791. This made Vermont the first state to join the United States after the creation of the Constitution. Unsurprisingly, Vermont is not all that important in the grand scheme of United States history, but there are a few moments where Vermont got its time to shine. Vermont, up to the Civil War, had many abolitionists within its borders, but none would be as important as Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens was born in Vermont, but would later become a representative in Pennsylvania. He was one of the major leaders of the Radical Republicans, a group of Republicans who wished to use Reconstruction to help African American slaves in the South with extreme legislative action. However, the state wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Vermont in the early 20th century, like much of America, participated in eugenics. Eugenics was a belief that arose from Darwin's theory of evolution, and proposed that people should be bred in such a way to improve the genetics of people, or basically breed people like animals, like this pug. The entire field of study was created in order to justify racist dispositions against minorities. As a side note, one time I was in a statistics class in college, and the old European professor unprompted began to preach the virtues of eugenics. And to support this argument, he quoted his favorite politician from the early 20th century, Gandhi. Goes to show how some prejudices never really have gone away. Oh yeah, we're talking about Vermont. In Vermont, there was a growing population of French Catholics from Quebec. This led to eugenics projects in the state being targeted against the group. Forced sterilizations were mandated for Indians, Indian French Canadians, and African Americans in the state from 1931 to 1936. This specific program would only last 5 years, but the hatred and alienation against these groups would take much longer to heal. Vermont overall from the Civil War up until the 1990s was very Republican. In every presidential election from 1856 to 1988, the state would always vote for a Republican for the presidency, except for 1964. That's 33 out of 34 elections going for Republicans over Democrats. This makes sense for such a rural state, but that's not what Vermont is known for today, is it? Vermont is commonly referred to as the most democratic strongholds of democratic strongholds, besides Washington, D.C., but that's literally an urban city. So, what makes Vermont so progressive? To explain Vermont's shift, we will follow the life of Vermont's arguably most famous politician, Bernie Sanders. If you've ever heard Bernie Sanders,
for 15 paid sick days,
you may know that he was born in New York City. Bernie Sanders was born on September 8, 1941. In the early 1960s, Sanders would join socialist activist groups in his university, and would become extremely politically active. After he finished college, Sanders decided to move to Vermont in 1968. This story, besides maybe some details, probably isn't too different from the many thousands who had also moved to Vermont at this time. Between 1960 and 1990, the population of the state would increase by almost 200,000 people. Since many of the people moving to the state were from liberal cities like New York City and Boston, the state began to shift politically over time. Additionally, it is also important to bring up that Vermont having many Republicans did not mean the state was overwhelmingly conservative. Most Republicans from the state were, and to an extent, still are known as liberal Republicans. It's a thing you only really see in these New England states nowadays. For instance, the current governor of Vermont, Phil Scott, consistently wins by comfortable margins during his elections despite being a Republican. These liberal Republicans tend to be very popular within the New England states. It's probably a cultural thing, though maybe it won't last much longer. What this means is that these supposed Republican strongholds could be flipped by the right Democrat, especially after Republicans became more conservative nationally. While it may not be entirely clear from presidential results, the political balance of Vermont was shifting dramatically in the state, so much so that by the 2000s, the state was becoming more and more solidly progressive. In 2006, Bernie Sanders would be elected as a senator by a significant margin, and he openly called himself a socialist. At this point, the liberal attitudes in Vermont could no longer be denied. The state seemed to go from a Republican bastion to a liberal stronghold in a matter of decades. As things stand today, while the Democratic Party isn't necessarily fully dominant in the state, seeing as currently a Republican governor, Vermont definitely deserves its label as the most progressive state. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and comment any video suggestions you may have for future videos. And with that said, goodbye.